Okay, so I'll give a very brief bit of context and a little bit of an overview of the methodology of the project, which you've got a summary of in your packs as well. So I won't spend too much time on that. I'll then move on to have a look at some of the key findings which seem to resonate most strongly with what we're discussing today, before looking at what the implications of those findings might be in a specifically rural context. And then I'll draw out some key conclusions on the basis of that. And of course, happy to discuss later on in the day and throughout the day about anything that might pop up that I don't have a chance to cover in the course of the 10 or 15 minutes that I have now. So to this point, as Alistair highlighted for us, we've discussed formal volunteering. And as we know, the key component or the key definition of formal volunteering is that it is to some extent mediated through an organisation. It's an activity which is done through a group or through an organisation, not for one's own financial benefit and out of one's own free will, with the definition from the volunteering strategy taken there. However, what I'd like to do is look in more detail at what an appreciation of that activity which might occur out with the most formal spheres of participation might mean. And when we talk about informal volunteering, we generally mean helping a friend or a neighbour in a self-managed way, helping them with gardening or watching their home. In that sense, this type of voluntary activity is profoundly below the radar, if you like. It's activity which wouldn't necessarily be picked up in the kind of questions that are asked as part of the Scottish Household Survey. More than that, however, as part of the study and as part of what I'd like to discuss today, I'd like to think about more generally what about the activities which might be more below the radar but still organised through a group to some extent. So, for example, community action groups, shared interest groups, what of that kind of activity, and how do we appreciate the greater context of participation with which an individual might be involved over time. So this term below the radar is something which has cropped up in some of the more recent academic literature. And generally speaking, it's used to refer to organisations rather than the nature of volunteering itself. At the moment, small voluntary organisations, community groups, and more informal or semi-formal activities in the third sector are understood as below the radar activities. By that, we might mean the kind of groups that I've discussed in terms of the community action groups, in terms of the kind of ways that people may organise without requiring an organisation in a formal way to come together. It may be an organisation which isn't constituted as a charity, for example, and wouldn't be picked up through OSCAR data. And as I say, there's been a great amount of attention paid to the organisations themselves. Somewhat less attention has been given to the actual voluntary activity and the nature of volunteering or participating in these below-the-radar activities. And it's that perspective that I'd like to build on a little bit more as part of this presentation. Interestingly, it's also been claimed that there's a lack of evidence around the nature and extent of below-the-radar participation in more rural areas, which is particularly interesting given that it's been suggested there are a larger number of below-the-radar organisations in more rural areas. Just a brief note about the research which I undertook as part of my PhD. I actually worked in 3 more deprived urban areas of Scotland, exploring the ways in which individuals become involved with less formal participation and the ways in which they might understand that activity, and how that activity might be linked to events in individuals' own lives. So I took a life course approach which actually sought to engage in people's own stories of their activity and how the nature of that activity, be it more or less formal, changed over time. It's been suggested that informal activity might in fact be more characteristic of more deprived populations rather than more affluent populations, and that's where this extract comes in really, insofar as it's important to recognise the diversity of types of volunteering that contribute to social inclusion, especially the more informal community-based types. In beginning to explore the ways in which individuals might engage with different forms of activity over time, I developed this idea of the different ranges of participation which might potentially be engaged with. I'd like to flag up at this point that I'm not necessarily suggesting that all this activity is or should be considered as volunteering, rather that it's different forms of participation. I aim to explore the ways in which people might move from less formal participation, helping out friends or neighbours, into more formal participation, what the barriers might be between that and what the drivers might be as part of individuals' own lives. And you can see in the middle here we have this blue sphere of community action or social participation, which is where we might perhaps begin to identify where action does take place, but it might perhaps be below the radar in terms of both measurement, in terms of existing quantitative surveys, but also in terms of how individuals themselves understand their own participation. So first I'd like to discuss the ways in which people actually talked about their participation. And I'm sorry to use these rather abstract terms, but hopefully some concrete examples of the kind of ways that people discussed would make them more meaningful. By holistic volunteerism, I'm trying to get at the idea that people described everything they were involved with as volunteering. So be it from helping out their friends or their neighbours, be it getting involved with the local community centre, or be it getting involved in a more formal way through an organisation. They ascribed the term to everything. I don't think I like that formal and informal volunteering, this respondent says, because I think it's all the same. You're willing to give up time or help or something to somebody else. That is volunteering. Just one word to cover the whole thing. But I wouldn't think formal volunteering doesn't sound right. So that was one approach to understanding volunteering. By using this holistic alternative phrase, what I mean is that people actually use an entirely different term to describe their participation other than volunteering. And again, they applied that to absolutely everything they did. So this very heavily involved what you might call a community activist who is involved with formal activity, helping out friends and neighbours, and also, for example, in that dynamic blue sphere we saw in the previous diagram. Said that, I don't know, I suppose it's just me helping out. Yeah, because no volunteering, and there's lots of ifs and buts in this, no volunteering just means me helping out, because just being the person I am, wanting to help. It's probably helping out. I was wondering about, I'm trying to think of volunteering as volunteering, but no, I would say it's definitely me helping out. I wouldn't think of it as volunteering, it's just me wanting to help people. So this is a different way of categorising activity which we understand in policy and practice as being voluntary and volunteering, but not necessarily from the point of view of the person involved. This final view is perhaps the most common view, and what I've called relational voluntarism. Things were more like volunteering than others. And this is how this particular respondent categorised her participation more or less formal. It's just what you do, or it's what you should do. That's not volunteering. Volunteering's more through an organisation, I think, something that's got structure. And you go along and somebody tells you what they need and you fill that role. So volunteering's like a job, I would say. So yeah, the less formal participation sphere of the diagram, that's just what is or what should be done. So in this sense, it seems that informal volunteering is very much below the radar in terms of how people understand their participation. It's not volunteering as such. It's more something which is part of life. It's something that you do. It's helping. Recognising that there may be different degrees of on-the-radar and below-the-radar activity from the point of view of individuals themselves, that opens us up to think about how there might be different manifestations of what we might actually understand as formal volunteering. So if we take the example of fundraising, for example, I'd like to present to you three extracts. The first is referring to the way in which raising money can occur totally out with an organisation. I've always found it quite a good community place. I mean, anytime if a family has troubles, accidents, anything like that, people in Edgeville are very good at getting together and looking after their own, if you like. Thinking about a family that's had a fire down the road, you know, folk very quickly came together to support and help with replacing goods for them and things like that, and raising money. So we have this very informal, not necessarily on the radar in terms of definition and measurement, expression of fundraising, which we might automatically consider to be formal in its nature. This is a similar extract, so I'll skip through that for the sake of time. But if we take it to the other end of the spectrum, we have this extract in the third part of the slide, which says that, well, I run a bingo in here on Tuesday and Sunday night, and somebody had mentioned that so-and-so was well known in the community. I can't remember the girl's name because it was quite a while back. And she needed a wheelchair. And it was just suggested amongst one or two of them here that, well, let's do some fundraising for it. So again, we have the way in which a fairly formal space, a community centre, might host a form of social participation, a bingo club. And from that, fundraising could stem, but again, not requiring an organisation to take place. In appreciating that, we might begin to understand the ways that actually there's an awful lot of activity which might be undertaken below the radar and below the standard definition of volunteering that might actually be equally relevant from the point of view of those who are involved with it in terms of their commitments of time, in terms of their motivations, but also in terms of being significant to those who might seek to involve individuals further in different forms of participation. So we might see that there's a diversity of formality, with it being understood as helping from the point of view of volunteers on the left-hand side, and more like volunteering from the point of view of individuals on the right-hand side, and yet still being fundraising in nature. My research also allowed quite in-depth access to the perceptions and experiences of volunteering, and I don't really have the time to go into detail about it here, but I'm happy to discuss later. One example might be the ways in which people actually found themselves being involved with more formal organisations, and that influencing the way in which they saw their participation. And to be honest, actually, the more I find about charity, I'm reading from the quote here, the more disheartened I get with it. I never realised, I started volunteering, that they start in a very business-like structure, you know? They have paid members of staff, they have paid area managers. I understand that it's necessary because you can't leave everything to volunteers because otherwise it would be unreliable and, you know, anything could happen. But sometimes when you hear about, you've got mystery shoppers, they've got targets, and they've got, I just think that, to me, doesn't go with my idea of what charity should be. So we're able to get a very rich understandings of how people understand their own participation, and also about barriers to participation. I won't be able to touch on the life course influences in this presentation, but in terms of the barriers, in terms of experiences or perceptions of participation, a couple of extracts here are quite interesting as illustrations. This first extract was in response to me asking, well, have you ever been involved with anything that's been through a group or an organisation? And the lady replied, no, I've never really had any time for that either. I'm too busy for the caring bit, the actual hands-on. But like that, there's a lot of good work that goes on. It's just, if you've got time for it all, you can't do it all. So there's a tension between activity which might be more efficacious in terms of achieving unmet needs, but also because it might be prioritised over more formal participation, or there might be a sense that you wouldn't actually achieve your objective or your motivation. So it's not me to do anything like that, Mike. I've always felt that if I can do something to better someone's life to make a difference, that you're not really making a difference doing anything like that. You are in a sense, but not in the respect where, well, I see the benefits of what I do. So again, a great diversity of activity which might not necessarily be organised through an organisation, but is still very much voluntary in nature. So what might this mean in a rural context? If we take a perspective which seeks to engage with the way that people understand and experience their participation, what might the implications be? Well, as we know, Helen's unfortunately not able to join us today, Helen Timbrell, but part of the work I suspect she may have been talking about would have been around some of her findings that she developed as part of her own research in Scotland. She worked in remote and accessible rural areas as well as urban areas. And she suggested on the basis of that that there were distinctions in the nature of volunteering in terms of how individuals understood it. And she made this distinction drawing on some work earlier in terms of the role of third sector organisations themselves, where it was suggested that there may be a distinction between substitutional third sector activity, bridging the gap between service provision and service need, and truly additional third sector activity, whereby there is something in over and above what would otherwise be provided to the community being undertaken. She suggested that when she worked in a remote rural area, that there was a lot of evidence of very substitutional voluntary activity being undertaken. So it was activity which did bridge the need between service provision and bridge the gap between service provision and service need, rather than adding something additional on top of that. And it would be interesting to take that further to understand how that impacts on perceptions of voluntary activity itself. To what extent does activity which is substitutional actually understood as volunteering? Is it, to go back to the early slides, actually understood as just something that you do? And if that is the case, then what does that mean for our appreciation of the level of activity in more rural areas? Timbrell also takes this distinction of broad or deep activity. And as Alistair outlined, we can't identify on the basis of Scottish Household Survey data whether or how many different organisations a volunteer participated with. What we can do is identify the number of hours, which doesn't appear to vary significantly. So Helen suggested that there may be a distinction between urban and rural areas, with urban areas seeing a greater amount of what she called deep activity, so across a smaller number of organisations but for a larger amount of time, compared to more rural areas whereby activity might be across a larger number of organisations but for less time in each activity. As well as that, there's been beginnings of some research to suggest that those in rural areas might be more likely to report having helped out than those in more urban areas, although that's something about which there's very little robust data. And finally, as I say, it's apparent that there might be a higher degree of below-the-radar organisations in more rural areas compared to more urban areas, and that may well warrant further investigation. So that leads me to make three tentative suggestions about voluntary activity in more rural areas if we were to take a more an approach which focused more strongly on the experiences of participation. Voluntary activity, more or less formal, may be particularly characteristic of more rural areas. That seems to be the case for formal voluntary activity. However, we don't know if that's the case for informal voluntary activity, all other things being equal. It would be interesting to see how perceptions of participation change between urban and rural areas. So the nature, below or on the radar, may also be distinct from rural areas, but again, there's more research required, in addition to the perception being substitutional or additional in nature. This leads us to the question really how far, well, I'll move on to this in the final conclusion slide because I realise I'm running out of time. Key conclusions really are that informal volunteering doesn't appear to be understood as volunteering. It appears to be very much below the radar and just what you do. Understanding how people talk about their participation might better allow for the identification of the diversity of voluntary acts that might be engaged with at any given time. So understanding that because an individual isn't necessarily involved formally doesn't necessarily mean that they're disengaged in their voluntary activity. And it also allows us to identify barriers of perception or life course to further involvement. So if an individual withdraws from participation, instead to focus on more informal and more fundamentally prioritised activities, and there is research which suggests that informal volunteering is more highly prioritised over more formal participation. That doesn't mean a lack of engagement, and it might mean they re-engage later. So if there are different compositions of below and on the radar activity in different communities, that leads us to question what the overall composition of participation might look like in rural areas. Is there a greater degree of activity which might be substitutional or additional? And does that mean that there's a greater degree of informal or formal or self-reported informal or formal participation? What does that mean for the capacity of rural communities to take on further responsibilities in terms of the voluntary delivery of services in light of ongoing public service reform? If we're to identify the capacity as well as the limitations for communities to engage with that agenda, it's perhaps more helpful to look at the more holistic picture of participation. So finally, from a practice point of view, it's perhaps useful to appreciate how potential volunteers perceive and experience their involvement to ensure sustained participation and to recognise that the withdrawal of an individual might not necessarily be long-term and they may return to that activity further down the line. Okay, I think that's me done.